Dwarka was planned on land reclaimed from the sea. That is not devotional embroidery added centuries later by careless retellers. It is there in the textual record in the Harivamsha, where Krishna does not merely found a city, but orders a coastline altered, a fort surveyed, roads measured, houses assigned, and a marine frontier turned into an urban one. Then the same broad zone off modern Dwarka and Bet Dwarka on the Gujarat coast yields stone anchors, submerged structures, pottery, and one small object I cannot quite get out of my mind. That object is why I kept returning to this. Not because it proves everything, because it refuses to sit quietly inside the explanations we already have. I need to start in the most conventional place possible, because this subject is too often handled badly. Dwarka is not some fringe invention. That it is a major sacred geography in South Asia, one of the traditional Saptapuri, and it appears in the Mahabharata, the Harivamsha, the Bhagavata Purana, and later Sanskrit literature as Krishna's western capital. The first systematic archaeological excavation at Dwarka was carried out in 1963 by Z. D. Ansari and M. S. Mad under Deccan College and the Department of Archaeology, Government of Gujarat, and published as Excavations at Dwarka, 1963. In the late 20th century, S. R. Rao, first with the Archaeological Survey of India and then through the Marine Archaeology Unit of the National Institute of Oceanography in Goa, pushed the investigation offshore. Between 1983 and 1990, teams surveyed and dived the waters near modern Dwarka and Bet Dwarka. Later scholars, including A. S. Gour, Sundaresh, Sila Tripathi, and K. H. Dwarka extended the work, refining the ceramic sequence, publishing on anchors, and using thermoluminescence dating to establish occupation phases on Bet Dwarka. This is, in other words, institutionally real ground, real excavators, real reports, real journals. In 1998, Gour and Sundaresh published Archaeology of Bet Dwarka Island. In 2002, Vora, Gour and Sundaresh published Cultural Sequence of Bet Dwarka Island based on thermoluminescence dating in current science. In 2001, an International Journal of Nautical Archaeology paper documented a group of 20 stone anchors found off Dwarka in 10 to 14 metres of water. Even the cautious summaries agree on certain basics. The coast preserves long habitation, maritime activity, structural remains underwater, and evidence that ancient settlement here repeatedly negotiated the line between land and sea. It is also worth remembering how geographically specific this is. Dwarka is not an abstract place name floating free of the coast. Modern Dwarka stands where the Gomti meets the Arabian Sea. Bet Dwarka sits farther offshore in the Okhamandal region, a place of channels, shoals, intertidal flats, and marine traffic. When researchers such as K. H. Vora mapped shoreline change and settlement phases, they were not trying to rescue mythology from embarrassment. They were trying to understand a literal system in which erosion, marine transgression, trade, and rebuilding had all left marks. The best scholarship does not say with a sigh of relief that the texts are true, so it says something more disciplined and therefore more interesting. The literary memory, the ritual geography, and the archaeology are all concentrated on the same difficult edge between land and water. That concentration matters. It means Dwarka survives simultaneously in philology, pilgrimage, and seabed survey. Very few legendary cities do, so when I say the subject matters, I'm not asking anyone to trust a rumour. I'm asking them to notice that the primary texts and the excavation history have both been sitting in plain view for decades, and that the conversation between them remains strangely underdeveloped. The difficulty is not absence of data, it is what we choose not to do with it. The anomaly begins with a detail most people glide past because they already know the story and outline. Krishna leaves Mathura under military pressure. A new city must be established. That is familiar. What is less familiar is the way the Harivamsha narrates the process. It does not say only that a divine city appeared, it specifies stages. Krishna surveys a site, he orders a fort, he tells people to take plots for houses, he asks that roads, crossings and walls be laid out. Then he calls Visvakarma, the celestial architect. Then he addresses the ocean directly. Withdraw your form in the water extending over 12 yojanas. Visvakarma replies that in no time it will be decorated with the rows of houses. A few verses later, the text states that by Visvakarma's mental effort, the beautiful Vaishnava city named Dvarkavati was built. It even continues into urban administration, wealth distribution. And the transfer of the Sudhama assembly hall by Vayu. I want to stay with that for a moment. A city in ancient literature is being founded on reclaimed marine ground by name non-human helpers, and the text preserves the order of operations. That is the fact. And it is not a small fact. Ancient foundation stories often compress everything into a single gesture. A king arrives, a god blesses, walls rise, the city is holy. This text does something narrower and stranger. It distinguishes surveying from construction, construction from adornment, adornment from provisioning, provisioning from government. It tells us that the shoreline itself had to be altered before the city could exist. It is difficult to dismiss that as decorative language, because decorative language is usually lazier than this. Decorative language does not count your Janus. The decorative language does not care about crossings. Decorative language does not give you the sequence. The mainstream explanation is obvious, and, up to a point, persuasive. Epics and Puranic texts encode theology, not municipal history. Divine architects are literary devices. Sea withdrawal is mythic shorthand. Mental construction is the language of sacred kingship. I accept all of that as part of the picture, but it does not close the question, because the same coastline later produces material evidence for settlement and maritime infrastructure exactly where the literature insists a sea-facing city once stood. Once that happens, the text stops being either pure history or pure fantasy. It becomes something far more difficult, a memory map written in mythic language. Before moving forward, this deserves attention. The Harivamsha does not simply glorify Dwarka. It ties the city's existence to a manipulated shoreline. That is a more precise claim than most foundation myths make, and it is the precision, not the miracle, that bothers me. The first layer of evidence is the text itself, because the text is more technical than it has any need to be. In the Harivamsha's account of the laying out of Dwarka, Krishna does not stand back while heaven improvises. He allocates tasks. The Yadavas are told to select lands for houses. Gardens and 4-road crossings are to be laid out. Survey of roads and walls is ordered. Visvakarma is summoned. The ocean is commanded to retreat 12 yojanas. Then the city is built, and built so fully that another chapter describes it as consisting of 8 highways and 16 crossings, with 7 great roads laid out for soldiers. Why preserve that kind of internal urban grammar if the sole purpose is piety? What kind of myth cares how many crossings a city has? The second layer is the afterlife of that city in the epic tradition. In the Mausala Parva, after Krishna's departure, the sea comes in. Later retellings condense the passage, but the core memory is stable. Dwarka is not merely abandoned, it is inundated. The city becomes a place the sea has taken. That matters because the archaeology of modern Dwarka did not begin with a search for a metaphor. It began because the literature had fixed the idea of a drowned western capital so firmly that archaeologists kept returning to the same coast. Why did submergence become the irreversible end of this city rather than a symbolic flourish available to any sacred centre? The third layer is the object I keep circling. During marine explorations around Bet Dwarka, researchers reported a late Harappan-type seal made of Turbinella pyrum, a conch shell. It is tiny, about 20 by 18 millimeters, slightly damaged, with a perforated knob on the reverse so it could be held, worn or fixed. On its face is a composite creature so strange that the first time I saw it I stopped reading and simply stared. 3 heads joined to one body, conventionally described as a short-horned bull, a unicorn and a goat. The published figure shows the lines cut into pale shell, compact and deliberate, the body turned, the heads compressed into one impossible animal. Yet it came from the offshore area of Bet Dwarka and appears in the National Institute of Oceanography literature as an Indus-type seal, with a composite animal motif. Look at this if you can, because no description prepares you. It is not large, it is not ornate. It is worse than that. It is intimate. A thing meant to be touched. A thing someone carried. A thing that now sits far from the world that made it, still bearing an animal that should not exist. What was this for? And the context deepens the discomfort. Bet Dwarka was not only a shrine site in later memory. Archaeologists have published evidence for shell working there. Bangles, beads, inlay pieces, manufacturing debris, and the use of the very conch species from which this seal was made. In other words, the object did not fall out of nowhere. It belongs to a broader coastal craft world tied to trade and identity. Yet that only sharpens the problem. If this is an administrative or mercantile object, why does it carry a creature that looks ceremonial, composite, and almost doctrinal? If it is symbolic, why is it built like a thing for routine handling? The object sits precisely where utility and strangeness overlap. That is one reason I find it difficult to forget. The fourth layer is the marine record itself. S. Gall and his colleagues did not find one dramatic ruin and declare victory. They found patterns, stone structures described in syntheses as semicircular, rectangular and square, dressed blocks, jetty-like features proposed by some researchers, and crucially anchors. And one paper recorded 20 stone anchors found in 10 to 14 metres of water off Dwarka during the 1998-99 season. Broader summaries by the same research group state that more than 120 stone anchors of different varieties were observed in Dwarka waters, from the intertidal zone down to about 16 metres. These are not proof of Krishna. They are proof of a busy maritime landscape with depth, repetition, and infrastructure. If this was only a pious mirage, why does the seabed keep yielding port behaviour? The fifth layer is chronological stubbornness. The 1963 excavations did not produce a single miraculous horizon that solved everything. They produced stratigraphy, pottery, and evidence of repeated occupation. Later thermoluminescence work at Bet Dwarka identified phases spanning the 2nd millennium BCE, which is the early historical period, and the medieval period. One published summary of the TL work described potsherd ages ranging from roughly 3,870 to 2,220 years before present at one locality, with other samples extending through the 1st millennium BCE and into later historical horizons. That is messy. It is exactly the sort of mess real coastlines produce. But it also means something else. This location was important for a very long time, important enough to be built on, rebuilt, traded through, and remembered. I want to sit with that before moving on. Why do we assume memory and material must line up in a single century before we let them speak to each other? There is another reason this matters. Once you accept long duration on a shoreline, the binary question, is this Krishna's literal city or not, starts to look too crude. Coastal cities migrate, collapse, reoccupy, and inherit each other's names. Ports move with channels. Sacred centres persist after urban plans change. A remembered city can be both older and younger than the ruins any diver happens to touch. That does not solve Dwarka. It makes the real question harder, which is exactly why I think it deserves better treatment. Once I accepted that Dwarka could not be discussed honestly in isolation, the pattern widened, and when it widened, it became less comfortable. Take Troy. In the Iliad, Book 21, Poseidon reminds us that he and Apollo built the walls of Troy for Laomedon. That is not a vague statement that the gods blessed a city, it is a claim that named divine beings performed masonry for wages and raised the defensive envelope of an actual urban centre. At Hisarlik, the late Bronze Age city conventionally called Troy 6 still preserves sloping limestone fortification walls. Their battered faces and offset courses so substantial that later viewers did what viewers often do when construction exceeds expectation. They moved the builders out of the human category. Different world, different pantheon, same logic. A strategic city appears with a wall too significant to remember as ordinary labour. Who laid the stones? Now move to the Andes. When Pedro Chiesa de Leon described Tiahuanaco in the 16th century, he reported local traditions that the great works predated the Incas and were associated with Viracocha. Later colonial accounts around the same sacred geography intensify the theme. Stones moved at command, buildings rose with unnatural speed, labour was displaced onto forces outside normal society. And there, on the ground, are the things that keep the tradition alive. The andesite gateway called the Gate of the Sun, the kneeling monoliths, and at nearby Puma Punku the H-blocks, cut with a precision still exaggerated by popular writers but undeniably unnerving when seen in person. As I discussed before in a previous piece on Andean masonry, I am not interested in fantasies of lasers and vanished super technologies. I'm interested in the persistence of a formula, a city or ceremonial centre whose builders are remembered as more than human, because ordinary explanation does not seem to satisfy the witnesses who inherit it. Then there is Uxmal in Yucatan. Archaeology gives us a Puc Maya city flourishing roughly between the 8th and 10th centuries CE with carefully dressed veneer masonry, mosaic facades, and the striking oval mass of the Pyramid of the Magician. The tradition recorded by John Lloyd Stephens in the 19th century from local Maya informants says the pyramid was built in a single night by a dwarf born from an egg, aided by his mother, a witch. Again, strip away the costume and look at the structure of the claim. Not a god of war, not a fertility blessing. A specialized anomalous builder attached to a specific monument inside a named city, operating on impossible time. Why that template? And then Nan Madol off Pompeii, a place I have covered in a previous piece, because once you see it you understand how memory changes shape under architectural stress. The site consists of artificial islets edged with walls of prismatic basalt columns stacked like giant timber, forming a ceremonial centre on a reef-flat lagoon. Pohnpeian traditions, recorded ethnographically, tell of the brothers Olusopa and Olusepa, sorcerer builders who brought the basalt through the air or with the aid of a flying dragon. Modern archaeology dates the main monumental phase much later than the wildest legends imply. That is not the point. The point is that the tradition does not say simply that ancestors worked hard. It says the city required a class of builder outside normal human capability, and it says so at a site where the material difficulty is obvious even now. These are not vague parallels. This is the same vocabulary appearing independently. How does that happen? I do not mean identical storylines. I mean identical cultural behaviour. When a city, wall, platform complex, or ceremonial nucleus pushes beyond the inherited expectations of labour, transport, or time, traditions in widely separated copied societies begin assigning the work to entities who are part architect, part stranger, part divine technician. The names change, the function does not. And notice what these traditions do not do. They do not usually say that the builders were merely stronger men. They say the builders belong to another category. Troy's walls are assigned to gods under compulsion. Tiahuanaco's stones obey a creator. Uxmal's pyramid belongs to a being born outside normal lineage. Nan Madol is handled by sorcerer brothers with aerial assistance. Dwarka is designed by a celestial architect after a sea withdrawal. Over and over, the builder is not just admirable, the builder is ontologically irregular. That is why I think these stories have been misunderstood by both literalists and debunkers. The literalists flatten them into event reports. Debunkers flatten them into childish fantasy. But the stories are doing social memory work. They are marking certain constructions as discontinuities, as things the ordinary order of labour could not comfortably absorb. Even if every stone was placed by human hands, the memory refuses to leave those hands alone. Look again at Dwarka in that wider light. Krishna does not merely receive a blessed city, he receives skilled assistance from Visvakarma, from the ocean, from Vayu, from the Nidhis who distribute wealth. Troy gets Poseidon and Apollo. Tiahuanaco gets Viracocha and animated stone. Uxmal gets the dwarf builder. Nan Madol gets wizard engineers and aerial transport. These stories are not all true in the same way, but they are solving the same narrative problem. They all preserve the intuition that a decisive piece of urban creation arrived too fast, too expertly, or too improbably to be remembered as straightforward labour history. Before moving further, I want to slow this down. The pattern is not ancient people were imaginative. Of course they were. The pattern is that when an architecture crosses a certain threshold, memory starts outsourcing construction to intelligences at the edge of the human. That does not prove those intelligences existed. It does prove something about how collective memory behaves when it encounters real feats it no longer knows how to narrate. So why has Dwarka not been investigated with the seriousness that pattern deserves? Some reasons are legitimate. Underwater archaeology is costly. The Gulf of Katch is not a calm museum basin. It is a tidal, silting, working coast with poor visibility, shifting seabeds, monsoon constraints, fisheries, shipping, pilgrimage traffic, and the ordinary bureaucratic friction that attaches itself to any long project. Institutions involved here have real limitations. The Archaeological Survey of India does not have infinite marine capacity. The National Institute of Oceanography has broader scientific mandates than one legendary city. The Ministry of Culture and related state bodies do not fund underwater research as if it were a national emergency. None of that is unreasonable. But those reasons do not explain the scale of the hesitation. Excavations at Dwarka began in 1963. Major marine campaigns under S.R. Rao ran from 1983 to 1990. A new ASI underwater push was publicly reported in 2025. But with a 9-member team and fresh plans for scientific analysis of recovered antiquities, 62 years, that is long enough for a site to move from curiosity to synthesis, and Dwarka still lives mostly as a dispute over whether one is allowed to take the texts seriously at all. 35 years passed between the end of Rao's principal marine campaign and the latest announced return. 18 years passed between the last ASI underwater excavation phase and the new one described by the Hindu. More than 120 anchors have been logged in the waters, yet the public conversation repeatedly collapses into two caricatures, either total confirmation of epic literalism or a reflex insistence that nothing further can be asked. I am not describing a coordinated suppression. I am describing something more diffuse than that, and in some ways more troubling. It is a distributed failure of curiosity. You can watch it happen in the literature. One paper emphasizes anchors and port activity. Another emphasizes ceramic sequence. Another compares the textual descriptions and cautiously notes correspondences. Another retreats into the safe sentence that the exact age remains debated. None of those moves is wrong. Together they create a landscape in which no one quite feels licensed to ask the full question in public. The result is a subject endlessly introduced and rarely synthesized. It is a distributed failure of curiosity. Academic caution becomes habitual. Religious claims make secular scholars defensive. Nationalist misuse makes good archaeologists even more cautious, sometimes understandably so. Then publications acknowledge the oddity and move on. Gao and colleagues publish the anchors, the structures, the seal, the ceramic sequence, and the maritime implications. Rao emphasizes correspondences with literary tradition. Later scholars refine dates and contexts. The pieces accumulate. But the central interdisciplinary question is still treated as slightly embarrassing. What do we do when a text preserves precise, impossible details around a place that keeps producing plausible remains? As I discussed before in another investigation of neglected sites, silence is not always produced by hostility. Often it is produced by paperwork, by disciplinary boundaries, by the low prestige of questions that sound dangerous to grant. Dwarka sits exactly there, not hidden, not lost, just perpetually posotoned. I need to be very clear here. And I am not saying the underwater remains off Gujarat prove every event in the Mahabharata occurred exactly as later tradition tells it. I am not claiming that a conch shell seal, a field of anchors, and a set of submerged blocks amount to a solved identification beyond dispute. I am not saying non-human beings built Dwarka and then left us a neat archaeological signature. What I am saying is that mainstream publications by Ansari, Mehta, Rao, Gower, Sundaresh, Vora and their colleagues establish three things at once. First, that the Dwarka Bet Dwarka coast preserves long repeated occupation tied to the sea. Second, that offshore remains and anchors attest substantial maritime activity in exactly the zone remembered as the city's western edge. And third, that the earliest literary account does not describe a generic holy city, but a specifically planned, sea-conditioned urban foundation created with named specialized helpers. That combination is in the record whether we like its implications or not. Why does the Haravam Shah preserve survey, plot allocation, walls, crossings and reclaimed shoreline instead of a simpler miracle? What was the perforated knob on the Bet Dwarka shell seal designed to attach to, and why was that object offshore? The record does not tell us whether the composite animal seal was heirloom, trade good, ritual toka, or something more administrative, and I find that absence harder to explain the longer I sit with it. Whose coastline was it first? Why do the marine finds keep being discussed as evidence of trade, while the texts keep being discussed as myth? When both are describing a city that defined by the sea, what exactly are we hearing in the repeated global memory of the impossible builder? Superstition, compression, or a damaged historical category we no longer have words for? When the Harivamsha says Visvakarma built Dvarkavati by mental effort after the ocean withdrew 12 yojanas, what kind of memory is being preserved inside that sentence? We do not know who or what the builders were. A small shell seal sits under cold light. It is easy to miss how unsettling it is because the object is so modest. 20 mm by 18, conch shell, not gold, a surface worn, not triumphant, a reverse knob punctured for use, and on the face that compressed impossible animal, its heads fused into one disciplined absurdity, bull, unicorn, goat, and all sharing a body no living creature ever carried. I keep imagining the fingers that turned it, the pressure of a thumb over the drilled boss, the little flash of pale shell before it was pressed into clay or cord or skin. I imagine the salt that touched it later, the long abrasion of current over silt, the years in darkness after the hand was gone. Then I remember where it came from. Offshore Bet Dwarka. The edge of the city, the texts say, was laid out when the sea stepped back and later taken when the sea returned. That is where I land, not at certainty, not at disbelief, at a threshold I find difficult to dismiss. Because if this were only myth, I would expect grandeur and vagueness. If it were only archaeology, I would expect fragments and caution. Instead, we have a literary tradition that names the helpers, then specifies the shoreline problem, and remembers the city as drowned. We have a coast with repeated occupation and maritime hardware, and we have one intimate surviving object that feels less like proof than like a witness. I do not know whether Dwarka was built in one night in any literal sense. I do know that ancient authors wanted their readers to believe that ordinary labour was not enough, and I know they wrote that near a coastline where material traces still disturb the water. The official silence on that conjunction is not scientific sobriety. It is a preference, and preferences shape archives. We classify the shell seal under trade, the anchors under maritime archaeology, the text under religion, the submergence under myth, and the shoreline under geology. Each box has a method. Each method is valid. But the city itself did not live in boxes. It lived where those boxes overlap. That is why the problem persists. Dwarka keeps forcing disciplines to meet at the exact point where they least enjoy meeting, where a sacred text names technical operations, where a marine site preserves long duration, where a tiny object carries a symbol system older than the story it now haunts. Before I leave this, I want to be honest about where I'm landing. I do not think the evidence licenses certainty. I think it licenses discomfort, and sometimes discomfort is the beginning of serious thought. A culture said a city was laid out with help from beyond the human, on land taken from the sea. Centuries of material from that same coast say the sea mattered, there more than later critics wanted to admit. That's enough for me to stop treating the old claim as ornamental. So I end where I began, with the thing in the hand rather than the city in the legend. A shell seal no larger than 2 fingertips, recovered from a drowned margin, carrying a 3-headed animal from a vanished administrative or symbolic world, still intact enough to accuse us of underthinking it. It does not prove Visvakama. It does not dissolve chronology. It does something harder. It keeps the category open, and perhaps that is the real disturbance here, though even now I hesitate to phrase it that way. The sea did not preserve a city neatly for us. The texts did not preserve it clearly for us. Both preserved fragments, but the fragments rhyme. They rhyme too often and too precisely around shoreline speed, specialized help, and disappearance. Once I saw that, and I could not go back to treating Dwarka as either solved archaeology or disposable myth. If a city can enter the record already finished, standing between scripture and seabed, what exactly are we refusing to call evidence?